All right, everyone, welcome. Thank you for joining us for the Complete Streets Policy Update. To get us started, I'm going to hand it off to Kat Hernandez, the Director of the Transportation Department.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us this evening to tell you a little bit about one of the initiatives that our department is working on. This is an update to a policy that was previously adopted by council. And we're excited to present to you what this update process is, what it looks like, and gather your input. So before that starts, I want to go ahead and introduce my team members that are on the call. Murray Myers, who's my transportation administrator, and he leads our strategic multimodal team. Also on the call as well is Isaac Levy. He is one of our senior transportation planners on the team, also assisting with this project. So again, our department is very excited about this and glad that you're here to listen in, and we invite those questions. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Zan.
All right, thank you, Kat. All right, everyone, thank you again for joining us. My name is Zan Marshall. I'm the project manager for this Complete Streets Policy Update. So I really appreciate you all joining us and contributing your information and ideas with us. Before we get started, I want to cover a few things. I want to make sure that you guys stay muted when you aren't talking. I'm also going to ask that you hold questions till our Q&A sections. We do have 2 breaks, so if you could please hold on to those, I'd appreciate it. Of course, if something is needing to get out, please drop it in the chat and we will try to answer any questions there as well. When we do get to Q&A, please use the raised hand icon so we know who has a question and what order to call on. And then again, comments in the chat will be recorded, so please feel free to drop ideas, questions there, and we'll try to get back to you on them as well. All right, so what we're going to cover during this presentation is a broad idea of what Complete Streets approach is, why the city is updating the 2011 Complete Streets policy, and right after that, we'll take our first Q&A break so that we can ask some questions about that, any ideas for that section. And then we'll jump into what kind of improvements will this new policy bring us, as well as an overview of the policy document section by section. All right, so what is Complete Streets? There are 3 major factors that I want to bring to y'all's attention to kind of describe what a complete street is. So the first one is a street needs to accommodate all modes of travel. So this could be a personal vehicle, it could be a bicycle, it could be a public transit, or it could be a pedestrian. This is important because historically in the United States, our streets have been designed and developed for cars only. And so really, to improve safety and accessibility for all modes of travel, we really have to consider them during our design and development of streets. The next main thing is making it more accessible to all users. And so there are different types of users on our streets, and that could be an adult, a child, someone with a disability, or an elder. And so it's important that the same way that we look at all modes, we look at all user types. So as I said, historically, streets are designed for cars only, and that can put a lot of different users at a disadvantage. And the Complete Streets approach is really trying to target that issue and make sure that every street is safe and accessible. This will also bring good things for our community. Streets that are more accessible and safe are more likely to be used by just the community around it. And so that can also really bring economic development as well and improvements to community life as well. So with those 2 in mind, flexibility is key. So matching a street's needs with the land use around it and the frequent users who are on that street is really important. And so flexible design lets us develop these streets with all modes in mind, all users in mind, with an emphasis on safety and accessibility. And so for instance, what this flexibility could mean is that our streets can look different ways. So right here I have 4 examples of San Antonio streets that have gone through a Complete Streets review and have a Complete Streets approach. At our top is Brook Plaza. You'll see covered bus stops, trees for shade and lighting as well, and sidewalks. And so these are all aspects of approaching and providing for different users and different modes of travel. On Nueve Street on the right, you'll see that it's 1 level, which makes it easy to move around it, as well as low speeds, protected sidewalks, trees for shading, and lighting as well. Santa Rosa's new street design will include bike lanes, 10-foot sidewalks, trees for shading, and some street parking as well. And then on Callahan Road, you'll see on the right side of the picture is a 10-foot wide shared use path, which allows for bicycles and pedestrians, and a 5-foot utility buffer between the street and that path. And so all of these are using flexible design to try to reach as many users and modes of travel as possible for that street. So again, that's really our main goal, making safe streets for all modes of travel, all users, with flexibility in mind for the context and land use around those streets. So why do we need to update the 2011 Complete Streets Policy? Let's talk about what it is first. So the Complete Streets Policy has vision statements, activation goals, including healthy living, which means having the ability to move around outdoors, pedestrian-oriented neighborhoods, enhancing commercial corridors, and maximizing capital projects. It also includes definitions, encouragements, and recommendations. You'll see on the screen some quotes, which highlight how the language used in the policy is already trying to meet those 3 Complete Streets goals, right? All users, all ages and abilities, flexibility, and different modes of travel. So that sounds amazing. But since 2011, we've seen a lot of improvements nationwide on the practice of complete streets and on implementation, which just comes with the territory of updating and having things out on the ground and seeing what works. So on the screen now is an example of Smart Growth America's Complete Street Policy Framework recommendations. I included this because they're considered national best practice and a good guide to work off of. They also work with American Heart Association, who also reviews policy and provides best practice recommendations. You can see here that it's a little more in depth than our 2011 policy, but we've definitely hit some of those expectations. So what we found after looking at best policy and doing a peer city review of current Complete Streets policy is that we need about 5 things. We need performance measures to track our implementation and to see if it's working, coordination within city departments, as well as coordination with other transportation organizations. We'll also need to update our design standards and recommendations that we provide, as well as creating project selection criteria and prioritizing equity. Here are some examples of the peer cities we reviewed and spoke to. We talked to El Paso because they recently have been recognized as national best practice as far as policy, and Phoenix and Dallas because they are currently integrating complete streets, and we want to provide a good update that can be workable and usable on the street. Now we're going to go ahead and take a break for questions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to unmute you guys real quick. So if you'll give me just 1 second, give you all the ability to talk. All right, you all should have the option to talk. Again, I ask that you use the raised hand icon so I know who has questions, and then we'll keep going if there aren't any. But please, if anyone has questions about the process, what a complete street is, I'd love to answer those questions for y'all. I will awkwardly sit here for 1 minute. So please feel free to ask a question, or if you'd rather, drop anything in the chat and we'll answer you there as well. All right, Christina Salazar, I assume. Salazano, sorry, it cuts off the last name on me.
Hey, that's okay. Yeah, Christina Solorzano. So sorry, I'm a little bit late to the meeting. I just logged in a few minutes ago. So I'm not sure if you talked about part of the complete streets process is education, where the education comes for the community. drivers, pedestrians, cyclists? And how would y'all, how would y'all educate everybody on these complete streets?
Sure. So I'm going to ask you to ask that question again at the end because I will talk about education a little bit. But I'd love to save what that might look like for a deeper conversation towards the end after we've covered it and how it'll be written out in our policy.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Lily Tarrant.
I wondered, are the complete streets definitions the same in other places like California or other states?
Yes. So the three aspects that I presented to you guys is pretty common practice. Now, how that's written out language-wise could probably vary, and I would have to kind of dig into a few different documents before I could say, yes, it's exactly the same. But they do have similar topics.
Thank you.
Trent Ingram? Did you have a question, Trent? All right, well, Trent, I can't hear you. So if you have a question, please drop it in the chat, and I'm going to move on to Tina Beecham.
Yes, hello. I wonder if the complete streets policy here for San Antonio area will mostly be covered so far as bike lanes, protected bike lanes, not just paint on the street.
I will say that there are different forms of like protected bike lanes, and I hear what you're saying. There's some concern about the safety of just painting a line on the street. That can be a real struggle. And I do want to say that we are going to be updating our design standards. So ideally, we'll provide good suggestions on how to put bike lanes on our roads and what's best practice for, say, the speed or the amount of lanes that are traveling there. So while this document won't speak directly to bike lanes, we are going to update our design standards.
Thank you.
Suzanne Scott?
Hi, good evening. You do have a question in the chat from David Macbeth, but I also was going to ask you, so when you're moving from the 2011 plan or policy to the current one, and you noted that design standards will be enhanced, I guess, based on the criteria of best practices. Can you give an indication of what maybe design standards you would feel need to be enhanced with the policy going forward in comparison between the 2011 and the one you're doing now?
Sure. I will have to get back to you on a detailed response for that question. But overall, after this policy is adopted, our implementation steps will require us to review our designs. And so we'll do a review, see how they meet up with best practice, see how they meet up with complete streets recommendations, and try to update those so that they meet that standard and provide good and flexible design for all streets.
Thank you.
And Zan, if I may, one example between the two is in the 2011 policy, there was no mention of any best practices or any guidance on what to follow at all. And as you probably have seen in the latest draft, we have, references to NACDO and other best practices on what to follow. It doesn't dictate word for word what you must follow, but it references some of those guidelines and policies. So for the next phase, that's something we can target and work on.
Okay, great. Thank you. So looking at some of those design standards that have been established sort of in the professional environment regarding design, urban design. Okay, thank you.
Yes, ma'am. That's right.
Tamara Callahan.
Hey, Zan, this is Tamara. I have a question about electric bike and electric vehicle charging infrastructure. Would curbside charging infrastructure be considered part of Complete Streets?
I would consider it a part of it in the way that it is providing accessibility and for all modes of travel. Now, is it something that's come up in our discussions or in the policy document? No, not currently, but again, we will be doing a review of designs and policy to update and meet complete standards. So I feel like it would definitely fit within that, and I think we have room for it, but currently it's not written out in our document. All right, unless there are any last questions, I think we're gonna keep moving. I do appreciate so much your comments. They're getting us to think about different things, and that's really what this meeting is for, so that we can keep fleshing out this policy draft. All right, so I don't see any other raised hands, so I'm gonna keep moving forward. Here we go. All right, so some major outcomes that will come out of this policy update. It will require that we review policy and code throughout the city. And so things that might include is the Unified Development Code, which is primarily used by private developers. And so we would be able to update that to provide better street design and flexibility for complete streets recommendations. It will also include the Design Guidance Manual and Complete Street Checklist, which are tools used internally by city staff on street projects. And so updating those will help further develop and provide better designs and flexibility so that they have more tools to work with. This will also, updating these things will ideally improve our street network, our multimodal network, as it will go and follow through with more projects that will take this complete streets approach. This will also require us to improve design standards. So we'll look nationally and we'll look internally and see what we can improve. And again, just really flesh it out so that we have plenty of different designs and flexibility for people to use when developing these streets. A next big outcome is the project prioritization tool. So this will have its own section in the document that we'll get to in a minute, but it will be a tool developed by city staff and through community engagement to define how we will prioritize projects so that complete streets approach is getting highlighted and more of the design that we want to see on a complete streets will go out and be on our projects that we're spending our money on, right? And so things that might be a part of this prioritization system would be like network connectivity, sustainability, multimodal infrastructure, equity, safety, as well as like service improvements. And third, this document will ask us to look at best practices nationwide and constantly look for new techniques, new interventions, and new street designs. And then also in this document, we're going to be talking about quick builds as an opportunity to put out temporary infrastructure on our roadways to see what's working, right? It might not be just a painted bike lane. We'll find out that doesn't work. We'll need to do a different type of design. And so that will give us the opportunity to play and build that flexibility in our streets. And with that will be education. Education on safety practices for these new designs and new interventions, as well as just safety practices for different user types and different modes of travel, as well as public education in those spaces. We'll also be educating staff internally so that as we update policy, staff are aware of the changes and are able to fully commit to our complete street approach. So those are some major outcomes, but now we're going to go section by section through the draft so you can get a better idea of what's really in this policy update. Our first section is vision and intent. We really built off the 2011 policy here since it had a really strong vision and intent, right? We're looking at connected, resilient, and equitable transportation networks, right? We want to make accessibility and safety a key factor. We're valuing streets to enhance the potential of all streets. We're making a commitment to Vision Zero to reduce severe injuries and fatalities, a commitment to stormwater mitigation and green infrastructure since San Antonio deals with severe weather, and a commitment to public transportation as a form of affordable public transportation. Our next section is focusing on diverse users. So this will be investing in underserved communities and prioritizing projects on our street designs to serve the most vulnerable users. In this document, the most vulnerable users are defined as low-income individuals, people of color, senior residents, children, youth, people with disabilities, and people living in households without access to private automobiles. And to help address these inequities, we'll be using DEIA's Equity Atlas to help define project prioritization. Our next section is jurisdiction. So this will require collaboration between city departments as well as collaboration with other transportation organizations to help improve the connectivity of our street network. This will also require that all policy and code be up to date and meet this Complete Streets policy update. It also will requires the creation of a technical review task force to lead coordination of the Complete Streets policy implementation, which we'll get to in a few slides, as well as creating a transportation committee that will provide oversight and accountability for the Complete Streets project. Our next section is called All Projects and Phases. So the goal here is that every street project or transportation project will have a level of Complete Streets review and take this Complete Streets approach at all phases of the project. This also, in this section, we state that all users in all modes are to be accommodated during construction of roadways. So that could be alternate routes or clear signage on closures of sidewalks, things of that nature. The next section is design. So it will require us to have the best and latest design standards and meet national standards. And it has a list of recommendations of what national standards we might be following, which design toolbooks we would be pulling from. And we'll also be having a level of flexibility that caters to San Antonio's specific needs, specifically stating that we will be trying to make all modes of travel safe and comfortable in all types of weather, including extreme heat waves and severe storms. Our next section is land use, context, and sensitivity. So this is where we get that flexibility back in, right? So it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. We're taking a context-sensitive approach that's flexible and sensitive to community needs. And in this section, we're also stating the need for complementary land use policy and zoning ordinances to have that cohesive environment between the street and the land uses around it. Our next section is implementation steps. This will state that the Transportation Department and the to-be-created Technical Review Task Force shall lead implementation of the Complete Streets policy. Now here, I do have the QR code to our Complete Streets website where you can find the draft. I have it on this slide and the next one because we do have charts that list out our implementation goals, which was a little too much for this slide. So I just have some kind of broad topics, but you can definitely dig into that document as well. But they would cover staffing needs, education, analysis of current policy and needed updates, toolkit development, and project implementation. So that project implementation might be like the quick builds we talked about earlier. Performance measures. Likewise, in this section, we have a full chart of suggested performance measures. In this section, we're also stating that there will be tracking and evaluating of this complete street policy implementation, as well as an annual report that must be shared publicly. Some preliminary performance measures include changes to the transportation planning process, new complete streets investments, project-based community benefits, and long-term community benefits. Now, project selection criteria. This is where we're stating that we will develop the project prioritization tool that we talked about earlier to improve safety and increase multimodal level of service on our streets. So we kind of already went through some suggested prioritization, but again, that'd be like network connectivity, bicycle, walking demand, existing crash data. And overall, this tool will include equity-focused criteria that directly benefits vulnerable users. And here is our last section. It's clear and accountable exceptions. So as I stated before, the expectation of this policy is that every project, every transportation project goes through a complete streets review process and uses this approach. There are some very minimum exceptions listed in this policy document on what could be exempt from following this complete streets approach. And to do so, they would have to request that and go through a review process with the transportation department and provide public notice as well as supportive documentation as to why they need to be exempt. And it is not determined that if they apply, they get approved. So it is a difficult process, and we want to be as transparent as possible if we're ever trying to give an exception. There are a few project types that wouldn't need a review process, which would be projects in final design because they're mostly complete. We kind of flesh that out a little bit in the document. Emergency repairs and routine maintenance because they don't change the geometry or really the flow of the street at all, and they're usually there just to fix a problem. All right, so that was a lot there at the end, and we went through a lot of different sections. So now it's free reign to ask questions. We can start digging deep into the different sections or major concerns. I am gonna pass it off to Murray Myers for questions for a few minutes. But again, thank you so much for coming and joining us. So again, if you could just use your raised hand so that we can know that you want to be called on for questions.
Thank you, Zan. And let me circle back to the first question, which was, how would we educate everyone on complete streets? Which is, I mean, a fabulous question, because as soon as any policy or plan is passed, that's usually the first step that needs to happen in order for everyone to be on the same page and start using the same playbook. So for example, the city of San Antonio, 40 departments, 13,000 employees. Our first steps would be educating everyone internally, whether that's transportation, public works, or other departments, on what's in the complete streets policy and get familiar with key terms and how we would move that forward in terms of educating the public. As Zan had mentioned, the different components within the policy. We would be tracking performance metrics, like, for example, number of new projects, and then we would report out to the community annually to share that information and allow transparency so that everyone knows like how we're moving forward with the policy. So those are a couple of steps. Hopefully that answers your question on how would we educate everyone on complete streets. First, it would have to be done internally so that as city employees, we're all kind of following the same playbook, and then talk with residents and city leadership as we're going through the bond cycles to show examples of complete streets and what a project could potentially look like if we use that complete streets lens. Let's see, I'll pass it to Jared. I see your hand is raised.
Hi. I noticed you guys had examples of peer cities within the United States and have talked about getting best practices from US standards. Is there going to be any attention paid towards international best practices on these sorts of street designs?
Great question. And I'm glad you brought that up because member from planning, Chris Ryerson, who I believe is on the call, showed us an example from London, which was really interesting in how they approached complete streets. They had a different phrase for it entirely. But in terms of policies and best practices and just kind of meeting international or national standards, what we looked for was Phoenix, El Paso. We looked at San Jose and other cities like that. And then we really followed and I'll pass it to Dave if you want to talk about the standards for city health and SGA. And that's really the measuring stick and what we were trying to follow to align with the latest best practices. However, to your point, we did look at some international examples, including London, and try to see what components could we borrow from there and potentially use here in San Antonio. Let's see, Tina, I see your hands raised.
Yes, I think I have two questions. Listening to you talking about education and then talking about trying to implement and adopt designs or things of that nature from international communities. First, on education wise, I would say to the panel and everybody, because I just attended the bike summit in DC, and I was on Capitol Hill during lobby day. And one of the House bills that was put forth was called the Bike Education Bill. Bike is called a Bike Act, acronym for Biking Instruction Knowledge Education Act. So that is just coming on to also educate the kids and things of that nature, sort of like a PE program, but for bicycling, trying to show them safety, bike safety, starting them off at a young age, and also PSAs for adults also. So that one is House Bill 7842 that you probably want to keep an eye on. And once that go through with more support, that we can potentially get behind, because I think that is a great bill. My next thing, so far as international, how do you think probably adopting the Dutch design principle for bicycle infrastructure for here in San Antonio?
In terms of that style, so looking at policies and plans, and just kind of going back to your first point, thank you for sharing that with us. I hadn't heard of the bill, but we can definitely look into that. And then pivoting to different examples, what we looked at, it was a process for us internally from the 2011 policy. How did the previous city departments and city leadership put that together? What were the top concerns at the time? It was primarily health impacts on the west side, and that's what drove the first policy in 2011. And then, of course, things have changed, best practices have changed, and we wanted to make sure we were in alignment with City Health and Smart Growth for America that ranks various cities across the nation. And so those components, the 10 components that Zan shared with you, those are what's in our current policy. And so that's what we followed. And in terms of looking at just another level, what city leadership typically looks at is what's the benchmark, or what are some of the other cities doing locally? And if we can align with some of those best practices and point to successes in other cities in Texas or nationally, then a policy or plan has a better chance of passing. If we're saying we're following a city from another country with different culture, different design guidelines, that's a harder sell. That's harder to pass through local leadership. And so we looked first at Texas cities, we looked at national cities, we worked with Smart Growth for America, we worked with City Health, we worked with the American Heart Association and Activate SA to put together the current policy that y'all can see today.
So far as the Dutch embassy, I suggested it and I said that because some cities and areas here in America has adopted the Dutch embassy way of doing things, so far as implementing how they got to where they are now, so far as I might say a powerhouse in when you're talking about infrastructure for vulnerable road users.
No, that's great. We can definitely take a look at it. I'm not saying it's not something we would consider, but just in terms of what we looked at first, that was our initial list. We can take a look.
Thank you.
See Yamini, I see your hand is raised.
Hello. My question is, how will the complete streets policy apply to roads that aren't owned by the city of San Antonio? So for example, roads that are owned by TxDOT, like what will that look like for those types of cases?
Good question. So in terms of the phases, what I want to point to really quickly is this is the first phase, is updating the 2011 policy. The next phase, after it passes through council, will be in the implementation mode. So what we're hoping to do is bring on a team or a firm that would evaluate the UDC codes or amendments, and then determine what possible changes we would need to align with our complete streets policy. In addition to that, we would also look at our design guidance manual, which helps drive how the bond projects or capital projects are constructed. And so during that phase, we would probably talk about where would we focus the project. So Zan mentioned the project prioritization tool. What that may look like is we may prioritize projects where the city has more control over those, meaning they're on city streets. So if it's a TxDOT project, that may be something that's lower on the list. So our policy really looks at the city roads, what we own and what we maintain, and then additional streets like TxDOT we would kind of consider. But I did want to give David McBeth the chance to just kind of clarify if I misspoke in any way.
Can y'all hear me okay? Oh, good. Thank you, Murray. Yeah, you know, this policy really is going to apply to city streets now. If we were doing, and we have some projects that we're doing with TxDOT now that are on TxDOT controlled right away. So that doesn't mean that, you know, we can tell them, hey, we're going to follow this policy completely. They control that roadway, and they're going to kind of somewhat dictate their policies be enforced. But what we can do is what we are doing on some projects like Roosevelt and Probin is working within our design parameters, putting in facilities that are safe for pedestrians and bicyclists within that context. So it's not to, it doesn't preclude us from doing those things, but it is somewhat a little more challenging because you have to get TxDOT to sign off on whatever design you're proposing within their roadways. Hope that helps.
Yes, thank you, David. Appreciate that.
I'd like to add just real quickly too, that there is language in this policy update that requires coordination, not just within the city, but with outside organizations like TxDOT, VIA, Alamo Area, MPO. So we do plan on partnering and working with these different organizations. But as David said, it is a partnership in that way.
And Dave Lofi, really quick, I don't know if you wanted to chime in on how you all set the standard for complete streets policies and how they're ranked nationally.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Murray. My name is Dave Lofi. I'm the Texas Director for City Health, and I'm responsible for promoting the 12 city health policy package in the 9 largest cities in Texas. So City Health assesses the 75 largest cities across the U.S. based on these 12 policies that are proven to improve people's health, well-being, and quality of life. Complete Streets is one of those 12 policies, and we at City Health care about complete streets because you know, they make communities safer and healthier by better protecting everybody who uses the street. And so we partner with Smart Growth America, the organization that was mentioned earlier, and you know, have developed criteria that we use to assess cities and award gold, silver, bronze, or no medal based on how many of the components of the policy meet that criteria. And Smart Growth America is our subject matter expert partner on this. They've been working on this for a very long time, and so we're leveraging their expertise, and that's how we came up with the criteria. And I can try and drop in the chat kind of our assessment criteria if that's helpful, and kind of how we look at different cities.
Yeah, thank you, Dave. That would be great.
Of course.
And Isaac, I know there's some questions in the chat. Are there any that pop up we haven't covered yet? We should talk about?
Yes, actually. There was a question that came up about from Jay, asking if there would be design options to make a streetcar free, or because it's a street, it must allow cars. Do you mind touching on that a little bit?
Sure thing. Can you say that again? Oh, Jay Howe. Okay.
Yeah, so the question was asking if there's going to be design options to make a streetcar free, or if it's because it is a street, will it allow cars?
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
Can I chime in?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Currently, the city does have a process in which we have converted streets into other modes of whether it's a closing of a street to create a plaza, or altering that street to allow other modes of transportation. So we currently have that process in place. And you may have seen that in some of our streets. Sometimes you might see them in the downtown area where we've done that. Main Plaza was one of those where we closed that portion of the street to create that plaza. So that currently does exist. I don't think we're going to alter that process in any way. But if there's an opportunity in phase 2 to maybe put it down on paper on what that process looks like, I'm sure that we will continue to do what we've always been doing when we are looking at re-envisioning areas that are part of a larger project or a larger scale.
Thank you, Kat. And Isaac, I see in the chat a question from Jerry about just the long-term vision for the process. So as Zan had mentioned, yes, so we're updating the 2011 policy. That is the very start of the entire process. So if that happens this summer, then we will move into phase 2, which is implementation. So at that point, we will be reviewing the UDC amendments, we'll be reviewing the design guidance manual and determine what changes need to be made so that moving forward, city projects can align with the Complete Streets policy. So that part could be quite longer. So we started this process looking at the policy from 2011, let's say fall of last year, and we were planning for it to go to council this summer. To look at implementation, that could be another year to 18 months, considering all the UDC amendments we would have to review, working with Public Works on the design guidance manual and how that would be updated, and then implementing that. In addition to those two components, we would also be creating, like Xander mentioned, the project prioritization tool, which would be a collaborative effort with the stakeholders and with the departments, and it may require integrating it into the city's budget process. So for those of you who may be aware, about 5 years ago, perhaps longer, the city created a budget equity tool, which meant that every department had to be trained on how they would, let me take a step back. Our Office of Equity defined equity and how it was to be addressed throughout the city. City employees were then trained on that and then trained on how to incorporate that into their budget process. So different programs and projects had to be aligned with priority, with equity goals. And so that went through the city's process through the budget. And what that did was it enabled city leadership to evaluate budget requests and then factor in equity so that they could identify which of those projects or programs get prioritized. It could be something similar with this prioritization tool with capital and bond projects. Would they be aligned with Complete Streets? Would they not? Would they incorporate, bus stops, shaded bus stops versus bike lanes? All of that takes time to incorporate into a city process. So that's why we've talked with our stakeholders and we've just kind of reminded everyone, this is a long-term process. We need you all, we need everyone for the long haul. And so this is the first step. But Jerry, let me know if I need to clarify anything.
I just had one question about something that you guys haven't touched on yet, which is we're talking about street design, but does this also expand to include intersection design?
Yes, good question. So intersections would be included in that evaluation as well. Let's see, trying to get to some other questions in the chat. So I see the question from Alvin, how would we measure the success for the Complete Streets policy? That's something, again, we'll talk about in phase 2 when we identify the performance metrics as part of the implementation plan. So if you've seen the draft policy, you'll see the implementation plan within it, which is a table, includes multiple actions, and we would define what those performance metrics would be. So for example, it might be, how many city projects have incorporated a complete streets component within the past year, within the past 5 years, and then track that and determine, is that bar going up? Is it going down? Has it plateaued? So that's to be determined in the next phase. Let's see, Isaac, any other questions we haven't gotten to?
Could you also, Suzanne Scott had a question about the timeline. Could you talk about the timeline in getting this first phase to council? And how many more meetings that we plan on having, and how long this public input period will be for?
Yes, absolutely. And Zan, correct me if I'm wrong. We have had multiple stakeholder meetings to talk about the policy draft. We've gone through a couple of revisions, or shall I say multiple revisions. We'll meet with the stakeholders again later this month, and then we will start going to the different council committees like T&I, Transportation and Infrastructure, or the Planning Commission. Once we have that draft, we're also happy to talk with different groups or organizations one-on-one. So if you want to invite us to present the latest draft, go through some questions, if you'll have any other suggestions, I mean, that would be the phase for input. We're hoping to get the draft revised and maybe go through a final round of revisions this summer. I think we were aiming for June for it to go to full council, but as some of you may know, those June council agendas are heavy. That may be pushed to August. And so we like to say summer of this year is when it would go to council and hopefully be adopted. After that, we would look at the next steps, including implementation in phase 2.
Yeah, and if I could just add a little detail as well. For instance, we're also going to disability access advisory committee soon. So we'll be getting to hear from different types of communities to get that feedback. We also have our website, which you can use the QR code here right now, that will allow you to provide comment, read the whole draft, as well as show support with one questionnaire. We'll also attend a few events where we'll be able to discuss that with anyone kind of passing by. But yeah, so as Murray said, those are just a few extra things that we're also trying to do. And we're also pushing it out on social media, in places like Nextdoor. So we are trying to reach the public. Oh, and we do plan to have one more public meeting and an in-person meeting. It should be around May 14th. I don't have it, my note right next to me, but it should be around that date as well.
And I see a question about other considerations like light rail and streetcar. So I don't know, David, if you're still on the line, but when they look at capital or bond projects, it first starts with the design guidance manual. And within that manual, and we can drop the link in the chat, you'll see there's a complete streets checklist. So each of the project managers goes through the complete streets checklist to determine which one of the components is applicable to that project. So things like bike lanes, wider sidewalks, street lights, bus stops, all those things are considered in each of the project. I don't think at the moment light rail or streetcars are considered, but that's definitely that's something we can look at in phase 2.
That was for me, Murray.
Yeah, if you have a second, can you talk a little bit about the process in using the Complete Streets checklist?
Sure, absolutely. You know, we implemented that when the Complete Streets policy came about in 2011. So it's been used in, you know, 2012 and 2017, the last 2 bond programs, and then of course the current one as well. But it's good to see this is getting a nice new fresh look as well. But we typically try to have our consultant teams that we hire go through that Complete Street checklist on each street project that we do to determine if it's a good candidate for any kind of complete streets tactics that we would employ in the design of that project. So it's something that we do on a regular basis. And of course, depending on the context and the desire for the streets and of course, and some public feedback that we seek during that bond process, we see what we can and cannot implement in those projects. And as far as VIA too, you know, we work heavily with VIA during once we're in that scoping process to determine if it's on a bus route, you know, what kind of enhancements could be included for VIA and for the bus routes that are along the corridor to make sure that we make sure that there's the chance to do those improvements, you know, with the bond program, just like we would do on you know, any other component of the design. We want to make sure that the VIA component of that design is included as well.
Thank you for that. And one follow-up, David. Looks like a question from Jay. Just allowing for the degradation of quality of service for cars. Looks like it's come up with other bond and planning meetings. Just maintaining the quality of service for cars. Is that something y'all look at, or how does that work within the process?
Well, sure. You know, of course, it kind of depends on the street and the location, the context of the street. So for us and for our traffic folks, we look at level of service differently in different parts of town. So downtown, you know, we can live with a lower level of service on certain streets than we would say on a major thoroughfare out in other parts of town where you want to make sure that there's good traffic flow there. But level of service is not to me is not the end all in this complete streets design. You know, safety is the #1 priority, not just for drivers, but for the pedestrians and the bicyclists too. So that's why the complete streets policy is there, right? It's to really bring all these things together to make sure that we're not just focused on cars.
Yeah, that's great. See, I'm trying to determine if there's any other questions. Isaac, anything we haven't addressed or covered?
No other questions in the comment section.
All right, Zan, I'll pass it back to you. Well, you're on mute, Zan.
I'm sorry. I was saying it looks like I raised my hand and I am not able to put it down. So I love that for me and for all of you. But I appreciate so much all of you coming on here, providing us feedback, talking about your concerns that you'd like to see in this document. It's really important to us that we engage the community, that we build this for San Antonians. And so I really appreciate all your comments. Again, we'll review the questions and concerns you brought forward. We're going through the chat to make sure that we catch everything. So we appreciate so much you joining us. I'd say we'll probably stay on for a few more minutes in case there are any last minute questions, but if no one really raises their hands in the next couple of minutes, we'll probably end the meeting, and we really appreciate you guys coming and participating.
If you find yourself with a
Thank you all for
question
hosting
later,
this.
yeah, thank you. I was gonna say, if you find yourself with a question later, go to the saspeakup.com/complete streets. You can leave a comment there and let us know, and we'll get back to you too.